Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll just give another minute or two. It seems like we just have a few people trickling in here, so we'll see if we got a few other takers that want to get on. As part of today's presentation, we'll be having Allan, Vyhnalek, and myself give short presentations on our respective areas that we work in. So if you have any questions as we're going along, you're more than welcome to either give either of us a call or an email. We are out a lot here in August and September, kind of finishing out our summer meeting series. So our getting back to people can take a little bit longer, but I know Allan or myself will try to get back to you as soon as we can. And with that, you are also welcome to, in your chat, or you can ask a question via the Zoom if you're comfortable doing that as well. We will try to address those either as we're going along or towards the end of the presentation. Depending on the nature of the question, it might be better addressed at the end. But also I'll try to make sure and highlight some of the questions I know are fairly common. We'll try to address those as we're going along. So. Hey, Al, did you want to say anything before we get started, or do you just want me to get started when the time strikes the right time?
I had to find the unmute button. I'm good, Jim. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you on. And Jim starts, so we'll let Jim talk about the land values and cash rents currently, now that he's got his final report done. So I'll be on in a little bit.
Very good. We'll go ahead and get started here. And I know Allan and Ryan Evans and myself will try to watch for any questions as they come in. Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. A little outline on what are the major topics we intend to cover today. The first set of bullet points there on cash rental rates, land values, and what has happened based on our survey to the land industry professionals. What is happening with respect to land auctions will be our first topic covered. As always, Allan will be addressing different issues and dimensions of landlord-tenant communication with respect to leases and certain deadlines you need to be aware of if you have a verbal lease. And then finally, we had to dig through. We didn't see a lot of questions submitted this time, so we went through and found a few other questions that we thought were pertinent given the current time of the year it is with respect to the verbal lease termination and land trading hands down with different things. We'll highlight some different things with respect to that, and also a concept called a flexible cash lease. I updated a few numbers on an example we have there, and we'll cover that as well. All right, so the first part we have here will be on the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Survey and Report. Annually, the survey gets updated twice each year. First update typically comes the second Wednesday in March. So the second Wednesday in March of 2021, we published the preliminary estimates on land values as well as cash rental rates. The final report is published in June and has additional detail as well as the final estimates beyond what is in the preliminary estimates report. The direct link to take you to any of the things we're talking about today with respect to land values, cash rents, things like rate of return on the land, that can all be found at our new website. You maybe have noticed this link changed. We've been doing a fairly serious overhaul of our farm management website, which is now called the Center for Ag Profitability. And it's cap.unl.edu. And the direct link to the real estate report is real estate. And if you're trying to find any of our archived land management quarterly programs, you would replace that real estate with simply the word land. Okay. All right, so the way we handle how the survey is summarized, if you're a regular viewer of our webinar, you're probably well aware of this, but we have 93 counties in the state, approximately 45 million acres of agricultural land. So that could either be grazing land or cropland. From that, we subdivide the 8 different regions into the 8 different, what we consider to be representative areas. And with that, we're going to be highlighting different districts today, but if you're in the eastern part of the state, say for example, if you live in Lincoln, Nebraska, that is actually located in Lancaster County, or what we refer to as East District. Also, the East Crop Reporting District is a very common verbiage, or what we refer to it as. Other areas of the state, if you go out to Grand Island, you'd be in the central part, North Platte's in the southwest, O'Neill or Valentine are in the north, Scottsbluff is in the northwest, and Norfolk and Wayne are in the northeast. Sometimes if your property is right along a boundary line, it may follow the trends of a neighboring district. It just kind of depends where you're at. Okay. All right, briefly, we always have people asking what's happening to the value of land. Well, the value of land relates to many different things, but one of the biggest things being the value of what we're producing. You use the power value of corn, soybeans, wheat, livestock, especially on the commodity side with respect to the grains, oil seeds, or small grains. We're seeing a period right now, prices are much higher than what they were a year ago at this time. With that being said, over the past year, year over year, we've seen approximately a 6% increase here towards the tail end. This was February 1, 2021 compared to February 1st, 2020. The prior year, we only seen a 3%. And before that, we've seen a slight decline over time, not a serious decline, but a slight decline. More recently, Purdue University in Indiana, they estimate that market value of land in Indiana later than what the University of Nebraska does. They do it later in the summertime, and they're seeing a very strong growth. They estimated the market value of land up almost 18%. So depending on where you're at in the United States, things might be even higher than what they are here in Nebraska. But it appears that the market value of land is recovering from the slight decline we had over time. And some reports coming in, they're even higher than 6%, but it really depends where you're at in the state. We're going to step through our final estimates on cash rental rates across Nebraska. We'll be highlighting the cropland, grazing land, and then stepping into the special features section of the farm real estate report. The Nebraska dryland cropland rental rates in 2021, the range that we had on cash rents fluctuated from $30 in the northwest all the way to $225 in the northeast. The breakdown, we tend to see that the eastern rates trend a little bit closer together than what the western rates do. The western rates can fluctuate a little bit more, but on average in the eastern part of the state, we've seen a slight increase to very steady nature of cash rents. In addition to the breakdown on cash rents, we had the average. So if you're an individual that takes your survey, we ask everyone that takes the survey, what is the average cash rent in a certain area? For example, the average cash rent in the North District was $57 an acre, if everyone sees that. We also asked the survey participants what they estimate the high third of cash rent is in an area and what they estimate the low third average is in an area. Those are referred to as the high grade and the low grade. We don't have anything tied to them with respect to the soil type, expected yield for corn, soybeans, or wheat. We simply ask, what do you estimate the low third or the high third is for cash rent, and an average of all the estimates. And move over here to center pivot. In addition to center pivot, we also report, the university does, on gravity or flood irrigated cash rental rates. For the sake of time, I will not be highlighting those, but they are available online. We tend to see gravity or flood irrigation rent anywhere from about $30 to $50 an acre less than what center pivot does. But the center pivot rates that we had reported across Nebraska, we have a pretty good breakout here. The eastern third of the state, once again, tends to kind of trend together. The central and the south are very similar. And then the western 2/3, it follows a different pattern. And with the center pivot irrigated rates, these rates assume that the landlord or the landowner entity owns the entire irrigation system. This would include the pivot, the pump, and the power unit. If the landlord did not own one of those components, you would address that in the final cash rental rate. So you'd more than likely discount the cash rent to reflect the fact that the landlord is providing one of those components for the system. Breakout on cash rents, in addition to the quality of the land, how good is the water you have in your area that you're irrigating with, the availability of water, do you have issues when it gets dry? The western part of the state, we've seen some of those challenges here in the last couple of years with the collapse and emergency repairs made to the canal out there. And we also see a pretty good breakout. We tend to see the higher rates once again in the eastern third, where the cash rents are a little bit higher. Western 2/3 are a little bit different ground and different yield expectations in those areas. And the final rate I wanted to highlight. So on the topic of grazing land, we also produce estimates on a per acre as well as a per pair or per head basis. The per acre basis would be the grazing land cash rental rate for the entire season. A little bit more common question, what I personally tend to see is on the topic of cow-calf pairs. So for one cow, one calf during the summer grazing season, which the title of the slide indicates that the monthly rate. The monthly rate across the state averages anywhere from say the high 30s in the western part, all the way to 60, or even close to the mid 60s in the North District, and closer to the 50s in the western or southwestern part of the state. The big factors to consider on the topic of grazing land: who's providing the fencing? So is the tenant providing upkeep on it? Is the landlord doing it? On the topic of weed control or brush control, trees, whatever. Once again, who's paying for those inputs and who's actually conducting the work? In addition to those two things, a water source. Are there any guarantees made? Does the landlord pay the power bill? Does the tenant pay the power bill? Once again, all these things are impacting the cash rents. And on the topic of the cattle industry, without a doubt, these folks are facing challenging times given the lack of rainfall in certain areas or a growing area of the state. Hay prices are high. Different feed inputs are much higher now than they were, say, a year ago with the rise in commodity prices. And things are looking considerably better on the crop side, but it's a little bit different deal on the topic of the beef side. So I would encourage you, when you sit down and talk about cash rents, be sure to be cognitive or keen of what is happening with these different things. All right, so I just covered briefly kind of some of the highlights of what we find to be a very common question on the topic of land values and cash rents. We're going to switch gears here and talk a little bit on what we refer to as a special feature section of the report. Special feature section reflects topics that are evolving, things that are pressure, so if we imagine 6 months to a year ago, what were the big issues? For better or for worse, the topic of COVID-19 and the different restrictions associated with that started impacting the way we conduct land auctions in Nebraska. Some areas of the state restricted in-person gatherings. Some areas had concern by the people participating in the auctions. Maybe didn't want to go because of their age, their health, whatever. So we asked the question, what were the adjustments made to land auctions in 2020 because of the COVID-19 lockdown restrictions, whatever your respected area had? Well, what we started to see, we had much, much higher incidences of increased online, combination online and public auctions. So these combination auctions, we tend to see people starting the sale, say 10 weeks to 2 weeks before the live sale occurring. And the public auction also allowed people to bid prior to the in-person auction, as well as during the live auction, if they're concerned for whatever reason about attending in person, they could conduct and participate in the auction via that form of event. We also seen a smaller percent. We didn't see much changes with respect to how auctions were conducted. We've seen some delayed listings as well as decrease in the public auction. And once again, online or combination online auctions, those accounted for almost 60% of the land auctions conducted in the state last year. So what were the major considerations on why people are moving to some form of live crime? The major things we've seen. COVID-19 was a concern. With respect to COVID-19, we also had concerns on the location, so maybe there was a restriction in place. The type of land, especially on properties that were in more rural areas of the state that maybe had some kind of a recreational potential for, say, like hunting or boating. You get into the western parts out by Lake McConaughey and certain parts of the Platte River, people enjoy the use of surrounding land that borders that. So the type of land has an influence on the type of people that might be interested in buying it or gaining a lot wider access to a wider audience. Bidder characteristics could have been anything from the individual's age, maybe their location, anything of that. And then we have the final category on why we've seen people moving to an online auction. We just termed it as other. We didn't really dig into it too much. But once again, COVID-19, the location of the property, type of land, and bidder characteristics, those were kind of the big four reasons on what we've seen people doing. So moving forward, so imagine taking the survey in March of 2021, we asked, moving forward, what do we anticipate people, what are we going to see people doing on how do they market their land? So we have people joining us today, they're absentee landowners, they might be considering moving their property somehow. What is the best way to do it? Or what are we seeing people do? We tend to see, once again, entirely online auction. When we say an online auction, we're referring to the auction company using some kind of an online service. It would be kind of similar to an eBay style bid, maybe even somewhat similar to some of these online machinery auctions. And with that, you have to get an account. You may have to be required to show proof of credit, have the ability to pay or get a loan if you'd purchase a property, and you would bid on it. And these bids may happen very frequently during the online auction. They may only be one or two a day or not even any during the day. Completely depends, but once again, the changing demographics in the state, we're seeing that online auctions is becoming a popular alternative, and that we're seeing a decline on entirely public auctions or public auctions that was the only option. And we're also seeing a decrease, just a slight decrease on the online auctions. I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see that online auction presence. We're not just seeing it in the land industry, we're also seeing it at farm sales. So if you have a farm sale for machinery, for example, liquidation auction, some of the bigger pieces, maybe not everything at the site, but tractors, combines, different types of implement, we're also seeing those go online. In addition to being online, so transaction method identified via the people going forward here. What do we see people doing? And what we're doing is an online auction, combination online and public auction are the two highlights. And also we're seeing the public auctions or the listing or sealed bid. Those are kind of the top categories with respect to the auctions. So every year I encourage people thinking about what's happening in the land industry. How do we evolve these things? How are they changing? Okay, with that, I'm going to switch it over to Al here. And Allan, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and turn on the video, we'll go ahead and I'll mute myself. And Al, you just tell me when you want the next slide and I'll move forward for you, right?
Very good. Yeah, and I don't know what we do about it, Jim, but you were breaking up a little bit. So hopefully my sound is coming through better. You can hear me okay, correct? Is that correct? Okay, thanks. All right, let's go on. Next slide. The late summertime is an excellent time to think about increasing communication, especially if you're a tenant. And landlords should be looking for this opportunity to I joke that it's time to be outstanding in the field. Now, Jim wrote it as it's time to be checking out what's happening with our crop or grazing ground. But I like the idea that the tenant would take this landlord, especially this time of year, and go to the property that's being rented, if it's physically possible to make that happen, and take them out to see what's going on. It's a good time for the landlord. I don't care what kind of lease it is, if it's crop share or if it's cash lease or flex lease, it doesn't matter to me. I think it's just a good time for everybody to just kind of check in and see what's going on. So you have communication with each other prior to having to renegotiate a lease again. You know, it's just, I think it's really important to increase communication, and that's how we keep leases stronger. Let's look at things like, did we have good weed control? Is there any disease or insect pressure or damage? Are we having a good luck with the soil conservation, or do we need to do something to fix that? Is the irrigation system in good shape, or what equipment do we need to have put in place? These are all just kind of a starting list of things that need to be looked at and addressed by the landlord and the tenant. This is a dumb example, but on my farm that I own, that my brother farms for me, a sizable branch fell off the tree. And so I'm out there, I saw it, I mentioned it to him, and he just took his loader and pushed it out of the way. And it would take me an hour with a chainsaw to get that same work done. And he did it in, less than a minute, basically. So it's just a function of communicating and having this all set up and kind of know what we're going to do there and coming up with a plan. Go ahead, Jim. Let's go on to the next slide. And some other things to observe on the crop visit, or if you get to look at your crops, is on Cropland, consider what's happening with wet spots in fields. We don't have any wet spots right now. Everything's kind of drying up. But and the weed issues with resistance, and then the disease and insect pressure, maturity of plants, see how things are going, all that sort of thing. And on grazing land, we should be checking that out right now, especially with the dry conditions, to make sure that there's still some grass there to be grazed, right? And what's our overall weed pressure, and then what's happening with noxious weeds or brush. And some of that, obviously, not noxious weeds, that should be a tenant problem, but the brush or volunteer trees or cedar trees or whatever, that's more of a landlord problem unless some other arrangements being made. So just understand that it's a good time to go out there and take a look at what's going on. And if we're going to redo the lease for September 1st, if we're going to redo the lease for a March 1st start, we're going to want to do it before September 1st. And now's a good time to have those discussions about what leasing things have to be changed or altered to make that work out properly. That's all I would say about that, I guess. And if you got questions about any of this that I'm mentioning, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A or somewhere. We'll find them, and we'll be glad to try and address them, either Jim or myself. And to go on to the next slide, please. The reason we have this particular land management webinar, quarterly webinar in August, is because of the approaching September 1st deadline. It has to do with the unwritten verbal or handshake agreements. For land that's being rented as crop ground without a written lease, we don't recommend that. We recommend a written lease. But if you still have any of these handshake or verbal agreements, I would encourage you to terminate that lease and get a written lease. And so the state of Nebraska Supreme Court defined that the termination notice needs to be given by September 1st, 6 months prior to the next lease starting, which would be on March 1st of 22. Cropland leases in Nebraska, non-written leases, oral agreements, handshake agreements, go for a year from March 1st to February 28th or February 29th of next year. So, and it also says, that with a handshake or verbal agreement, you have to give 6 months notification, which is by September 1st, not on September 1st, by September 1st. Now, pasture leases are a little bit different. Pasture leases are 5 or maybe 6 months long, and they end. So because the pasture lease ends, it's no longer in effect the next year. And so that really there's no 6 month termination notice necessary, not really, because the pasture lease ends. And so the tenant should be asking for that pasture lease every year, especially if it's an oral agreement. But I would, again, recommend a written pasture lease. And then the written pasture lease can be made for however many years you want to make it, that sort of thing. and you would just follow in any case in any time you have a written lease, you just follow what the written lease says in terms of termination notice, when it starts, when it ends, all those types of things. So just understand that pasture leases are different than cropland. Cropland requires a 6-month notification before that lease ends. I had a situation where a tenant was given notice in the fall, later in the fall, like in October. The landlord said, we want the lease to end, and the tenant declined. He said, I've got another year on this lease, and the reason the landlord wanted to end the lease is because they were selling the property. And the bottom line on that is that you could still sell the property even though the lease is still in effect. It has to be one of the provisions of the sale is that this particular tenant gets to farm that ground one more year with whatever lease is in effect, whatever lease is in place. But especially if you're selling property, then it's a good idea to get the termination notice out there. Let's go on. So we recommend a written lease. I don't know if a higher value over verbal leases is the key here. The key here is that if Jim and I agree to a lease and we have a handshake or verbal agreement, and one of us then leaves, then let's say that I no longer continue to exist. I have my demise. Then Jim has to work with my wife, the widow in this case, and if she doesn't know what the lease arrangements are, then it creates a lot of unforeseen problems, given that they've never seen that sort of thing. The other thing to know is that it's just better to have things written down and have things clear. It just works better so they can manage the estate better. For instance, a lady calls me up and says, my mom's in a nursing home. She has dementia. She can no longer tell me about what the farming arrangements were. And she was one of the proud people of ethnic background here in eastern Nebraska that didn't share their business with anyone because their business was their business alone. And so therefore, the lady then had to deal with a lease, a tenant. And I said, well, just follow what the lease says. And she said, that's the problem. I don't have a lease. It's a verbal or handshake agreement between my mother and the tenant. So that puts her in an uncomfortable position. So, and this lady had been off the farm for 40 years, and that's a story that speaks to the last point I made, is that an absentee third party may not have current knowledge or experience in the ag industry to be able to handle that lease efficiently. Okay, let's go on. Next slide, Jim. Okay, here we go. So it's a great time to look at releases, and if you have to, update them, because you should look at what's happening with conservation practices and who's doing what. We should look at non-cropland weed control, make sure in eastern Nebraska that the eastern red cedars are being controlled somehow. We have to look at the timing of the lease payment. Even though the lease starts on March 1st, doesn't mean we do the payment up front. Sometimes we split it between spring and fall. Sometimes you just backload it and make, especially for relatives, you just have the relative pay the lease clear at the end. When is your lease termination notice date? Make sure that in a written lease that you have a termination notice in there. And now I like the September 1st notification, even for a written lease, because when do the farmers want to buy inputs for all the farms they're farming? Well, they usually buy a lot of those inputs in the fall, because that's when they get the discounts for their fuel, for their fertilizer, for their seed, all those kind of discounts that they get. And they need to take advantage of that. And so if they want to order their right amount, then we have to give them a kind of a termination sometime in the fall. And look over the other provisions. Now, yes, okay, all right. I think that's all I need to say on that slide. Let's go on. All right, when should lease be renegotiated? Okay, so this question comes in. And it's a written lease. It's going to go on to the next year and on to the next year and on to the next year. But they have a provision in there that says we're going to allow time, or a period of time in here, to look at the prices. Look at the value of the lease, what the lease is, and make some adjustments for the next year. It's kind of it's a rollover lease. It's rolled over in terms of the lease will still be in effect, but they want to renegotiate the price a little bit every year and adjust that up or down as needed. It's a cash lease. And the point is, I would suggest that you do that pretty much at the same time every year, because the problem you have is that when prices are going up, the landlord will want to wait and negotiate the lease later. When prices are going down, the tenant will want to wait and negotiate the lease later. And so I think that the landlord will want to do it up front. So I think you have to kind of specify when you're going to renegotiate that lease in terms of the rate, so that you respect both parties and no one's dragging their feet. Then they know when it's going to happen. And it does not have to be by September 1st. It could be pretty much any time between September 1st and March 1st, in my view. Some people will do it in August. Some people will do it for next year. That right now, some people will do it right before, if they're lucky and the landlords are lucky enough to have a place down in Arizona or Florida or somewhere, and before they go south for the winter, they want to get that negotiated because they don't come back by March 1st. And some people wait until February to do that. All those are perfectly acceptable. Just make sure that both parties agree. Okay. All right, let's go on. I think we go on. The way to, if you have don't have a written lease, and the way to get to a good written lease, or at least a shell of a good written lease, at least a template, is to use aglease101.org. That website is put together by the economists from the 12 north central states that make up the extension district. Goes from Kansas to North Dakota, over to Ohio, and then up to into Michigan, and then all the states kind of in between. And Anyway, the point is, there's some good stuff at that website, and you go to the document library, and you come up with this page here, and you'll see on the right hand side of the page, he has cash farm lease forms, crop share lease forms, pasture lease forms, livestock building or farm building lease forms. It's got all kinds of things on this page. And one thing we get asked about, Jim and I get asked about quite a bit, is the rate at which you could rent a farm building, and it's down here in the lower left, the farm building rental rate survey. And even though that's a little out of date, it's still the best survey we've got. We don't have anything better than that right now. We just don't. So I think that was my prepared comments.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
One question come in, and it kind of relates somewhat to your topic and somewhat to some of my things, Al. Connie writes in, and she says she's looking at selling some irrigated cropland. And the basic question is she has a lease outstanding on it for 5 years on the lease. So there must be a long-term lease on the property. They're trying to think about selling it. Where do you start to get an offer? Do you consider the current tenant first? Do you put it out on public auction? I think that would probably be a little bit about your line. And then the second part of the question is, how do you value the property if you'd want to sell it to your tenant, for example? So do you want me to take this, or do you want to kind of cover the first part and then I'll talk about how to value it, or what are you thinking?
Just say what you're going to say, and then I'll say what I'm going to say, because I'm still thinking about what I want to say.
So okay, questions are starting to pour in. All right, so let's start with the first one from Connie. With respect to selling a property, it's your land. You can do whatever you want with it. Now, many landlords do find some degree of value, and if they have a long-term tenant, maybe he's a family friend, neighbor, whoever, selling it to the tenant, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. How do you value it? Well, it depends what you want for your property. If you truly want to know what the current market value is, I would highly suggest getting an appraisal. An appraisal is a third-party opinion of value. What is your property worth given all the unique attributes to it? Now, on the topic of, will it bring more if I sell it to my tenant? Will it bring more if I sell it in public auction? You never know for sure. If you sell it at public auction, there might be somebody that's really interested in it. The unique quirk to your property is you do have an outstanding lease on it. If that lease is going to run for 5 more years and you decide to sell the property, you as a current landlord do not receive payment to that. You do not get the rent from it if you would choose to sell it. Whoever sells the property and whoever buys it, the new purchaser of the property, would get the rental payment. Now, if the current tenant pays it, obviously they wouldn't pay themselves rent. But yes, it is something to be thinking about if you have a long-term lease on it. So I would tell you, just be aware that if you choose to do some of these things, I see nothing wrong asking your tenant if they'd be interested. Ask them what they might be willing to offer or how they would like to handle that transaction. Definitely, you can visit with real estate professionals and go that route if you choose to as well. Just be aware, selling a property with a long-term lease, depending on what the current rent is that you're receiving, could or could not, it may or may not impact the value of the property. So, Al, do you have anything to add to that?
It's an interesting question because, what was your relationship with your tenant? If it's been a really close relationship, if it was a friend of your parents or a friend of the families, maybe you want to consider that and not putting it on a public auction and let them have the first chance to get it. If you're you run the risk of them trying to like lowball you a little bit, I guess, maybe. But I agree with Jim's comment about getting it appraised. I like that way better than I like using the tax valuation. And you could go with the appraisal and then go with 80% of the appraisal or 70% or 90% of the appraisal or 110% of the appraisal. I mean, that's kind of up to you. And I think giving the tenant the first chance is a nice thing to do, especially since they've got the lease on it. Those, I guess that's all I have to say. If you got other questions, make sure you ask. And then we have Terry here. It says, the UNL library have go ahead.
Let me add on that. The other thing is if the tenant needs to secure financing to purchase that ground, they're more than likely going to be getting an appraisal done on it anyways. So you can knock two birds out with one stone, right? Okay. All right, Al, go ahead with the next one.
Well, does UNL have a verbal lease termination form? No, we do not. And the reason we don't is primarily because you can't always write it to fit every situation. So to avoid the liability problem, if I gave you a lease termination form and it didn't fit, it didn't meet the legal standard for your situation, then you consider me to be in problem. And so I think if we actually, Jim, I think we went on to the next slide, we talk about what you would put in this verbal lease termination letter, possibly. Is that the next slide?
I think my question's next, and then.
Oh, okay, all right. We're gonna. So let me show you some things we would put in a verbal lease termination letter here in just a few minutes. The other question is, what happens if you don't set next year's rent by September 1st? What happens if renters don't agree on the new cash rent amount? That's the hazard with that. I mean, if you and the tenant get along great, or the tenant and landlord get along great, then I wouldn't worry about when I set the rental rate, just get it done. But agreed, this is when we're going to do it. We're going to do it now, before September 1st, or by Thanksgiving, or by Christmas, or by next March. And however, if it's contentious, if you don't think you're going to agree on what the timing should be, then I absolutely would get it done by September 1st, or there should be a termination notice put out. Either it's a written lease or verbal lease, I'd still terminate it. So it kind of depends on what that relationship is. Jim, you got more to add? Go ahead.
No, you're exactly right on that. You can set the cash, if the two of you agree, okay, I'm going to rent the ground from Allan, we can agree to set that cash rent next July if we want. I wouldn't probably push it out that far, but the point is you don't have to set it on September 1 if the two of you mutually agree to set it at a different date. By March 1st or March 15th is kind of a very common time when people know where they sit with their crop insurance guarantees and some of that kind of thing. Otherwise, you will revert. If you cannot agree on that time, you'll revert to whatever provisions are in that current verbal lease Allan was talking about. Okay, so that's all I seen come in for questions now. We got a couple prepared questions. We're going to run through those quick. And then if anything else comes in, I'll keep an eye out. All right, so the topic of flex leases is coming up a little bit more this year because of we've seen quite a fluctuation in commodity prices. And how do you set up a flex lease? This is just kind of a, not even a bare bone example, but it gives you some ideas to be thinking about. Let's say that you agree with the landlord, or the tenant group, or the landlord agrees with the tenant. Your base cash rent for a flex lease should be $175 an acre. But based on some factor, it could be yield, price, crop revenue, livestock prices, whatever. Now you're hopefully not renting out your grazing land at 175 an acre, but the same idea would apply with different numbers. Whatever you choose to rent that ground out on and flex it on, that flex lease, one way to set it up is you could let the cash rent go up. You could let it go up to the ceiling, or you would let it come down to a minimum rate if something really bad happens, if the crop yield falls, prices fall, or a combination of the two. So the range that you would rent inside of, in this example, would be from a minimum of 140 to a maximum of 210. Now we move into the growing year, and there's a lot of information on this slide. And once again, these slides will be posted at that cap.unl.edu/land later on today or tomorrow. And what we see here is the breakout. Let's say you're renting a parcel of ground. This space is going to raise about 130 bushel per acre. In this example, the planting time price guarantee with crop insurance is about $4.58, or you anticipate you're going to get around 4.5 a bushel. Now on the left-hand side, we see here prices this fall actually end up at $5.03. And this might be a little low, but the point is we have a case where prices go higher than what we had anticipated. If you work through the math on this, that price, the difference between 503 versus 458, it's about 9% higher than we had anticipated. Under this case, we're going to move down to the bottom here. We're going to add 9% onto our cash rent. And our final cash rent that we're going to receive is $192 an acre. And we're going to receive that cash rent because remember, we're inside our range. If prices had gone up to say $6 a bushel, the most you would be on the hook for, the maximum would cap out at 210 an acre. Now on the right-hand side, once again, when we signed the lease, we thought, okay, it should be about 175 an acre. That's our base cash rent, 130 bushel APH, and the planting time price guarantee was 458 a bushel. Now, instead of prices trending up, they actually trended down. They trended down almost 10%. So the prices were off. They're down to 413 a bushel. If that's the case, we're going to actually take off, deduct, and we're going to take that off our cash rent. Remember, our minimum is 140, so as long as you're inside that range, you're just fine. And with this case, final cash rent is going to be $158 an acre. Okay. All right. Now this next question here, I'm going to let Al. He can expand on this a little bit. Go ahead, Al.
So it has to do with the question that was typed in, what provisions need to be in a verbal lease termination letter. And so you need to have appropriate information to get this letter to be legal. And it would include what you need to have it dated. You need to have the address of the landlord at the top, and address that the tenant, the person, or excuse me, whoever's receiving the letter at the top, whoever's sending the letter at the bottom. You need to have some kind of a maybe not a full legal description of the property, but pertaining to the 160 acres that you rent from me in section 27-3-3 in the Pleasant Hill Township of Saline County, Nebraska, something like that in there. And then stating the termination of the lease. So this is to let you know the lease is terminating on February 28th of 22. And this is sent before September 1st of 21. So therefore, we're asking this lease will cease. The thing I don't have on this slide is I think that you also maybe need to make a statement, if it fits your situation, that says that by this date, in addition to ceasing all farming operations, you shall you shall remove all personal property. In case they parked a cultivator or something at the end of the field and they kind of leave it there, they need to remove all their personal property before March 1st too, or by February 28th. And in some cases, you're just trying to move from a verbal handshake agreement to a written lease. You were willing to stay with the same person. We'll just say that. You can say that termination letter. We're very willing to have a written lease, but please contact us and let's get a written lease put in place. And and so this lease land, and let's get something going. And then and please send it via certified mail so that you have that the party that's receiving the letter has to sign for it, and you get that signature back to prove that they received it. I had an ugly deal come up this year where even though the landlord had spoken with the tenant and spoke verbally, said your lease is ending. He didn't send a certified letter thing, and the tenant goes, you didn't send a certified letter. I don't think you said that. That's not what you said. And so that was messy, and I'm not going to go any further into that deal. But the problem is, but what we have to do is get their signature saying they received that letter, so they have a return receipt that they received it. And so that's basically it. Date it at both addresses, describe the property, say it's the lease is ending as of February 28, 2022. And, and then any other thing, remove your personal property. And I don't know, I think that takes care of it. Jim, you got anything else to add to that?
No, if you're not comfortable typing one of these letters up, I'm assuming a lot of the rural attorneys, you could probably get them to put a letter together. You may have something on file, and they just need to update the legal description in that. You can probably get something done for, I don't know, an hour of their time, $150 or something. It's usually pretty inexpensive. All right, next question. I guess this next question here kind of parallels that very first question that Connie had asked. Do you want to highlight this one too?
Sure. If the ground will be sold, yeah, I kind of already talked about this a little bit. The professional courtesy to tell the other party, no matter what's happening, if you're going to make a change in ownership of the land, and you try and do it, you try and get this notification done as soon as possible, and you try and get the lease terminated. I think it just makes it easier to sell the land if it doesn't have a existing lease on it. The only thing that gets messy here is if you have a lease that goes for 2, 3, 4 years, or the 5 years that the question came in that mentioned. But just understand the land could be sold with a lease attached to it. That person gets to ride their lease out, or you can contact your attorney who contacts them and their attorney, and you can see what it would take to buy them out of their lease or have the lease and go away. I had one situation where a relative was going to sell their land, and the other a relative, a cousin or brother or somebody, was farming it, and so they just went to them and they worked that out. There was no legal entanglement there because they were going to stay as family. So you don't all necessarily have to be ugly. You just start communicate clearly and communicating writing.
Yeah. There's no legal requirement that the tenant has to be bought out or that they have to accept it. If you offer them so many thousand to vacate the lease, it's completely optional, but it's like Al said, it can facilitate the process sometimes. Before we I know we're going to start losing people here. Those were all the questions we had prepared. And I think there might have been one more question that came in regarding the flex lease example. What dollars per bushel number would you recommend when comparing planting and harvesting time prices from the local elevator cash price during planting, harvest, futures, assure? So let's go back to this question here. The question is basically, if I'm not understanding it right, should we be using the planting time price guarantee from crop insurance? Should we be using the local posted cash price at the local elevator, the futures price, whatever? I'm fine with using any of those prices. It's what can the landlord and the tenant both agree upon. The reason I use the planting time price guarantee from crop insurance was it's a number you can easily find. You can find it online. You can call a crop insurance agent. They can tell you it's over a period of time. So regardless of which price you use, make sure when you pick a price, make sure that you use the price that is over a period of time. So if you want to use the local cash price at the local elevator, pick, every Friday in whatever month and make an average from that. Do it over a period of time. Just don't use one day. If you use only one day, that can cause problems because maybe prices were really good that day. Maybe they were really down that day based on what happened in the economy or whatever. So I would strongly suggest if you do use a price, use one from over a period of time. The planting time price guarantee from crop insurance, I believe that's over a 1 month period, the days that the trade is open.
It's my observation after working with people on flexible leases for a number of years now, albeit still a small number, but there's still people doing that all the time. Setting your price, determining how you're going to set your price and when you set the price, it's probably the trickiest part of setting up a flex lease. So just do that carefully and give it some thought, and using some kind of an average like what Jim described is very appropriate. If you look back at 50 years of corn prices, for instance, about 75 to 80% time, the price will be better in the spring. And then the other 20 to 25% of the time, the price will be better in the fall. So consider that too. Don't just always use a harvest price, because that won't always be the highest for that year. So, but setting that price is the trickiest part.
I like focusing on crop revenue, because just because you have a good or bad price doesn't mean the overall crop revenue is. You can have lower prices, but if you get rainfall, especially on dry land, even irrigated to a lesser extent, if you have plentiful rain, good subsoil soil moisture to start the year off, that can make a big deal. Right now, going into 2022, unless we get a ton of snow or a lot of rain this fall, we are definitely deficient in moisture. We're probably gonna get through this year, but next year, I don't know. It's darn dry in certain areas. All right, I wanted to highlight the last thing here. Brian Evans, our media contact here for the department for the Center for Ag Profitability, has been working really hard on updating our website. And if you go to cap.unl.edu, on that website, and you got to scroll down a ways, and there's a lot of information on there because Ryan puts a lot of good things on there. But towards the bottom, you can actually find a listing of upcoming meetings. And I maybe shouldn't have put today's meeting on there, but I took a screenshot and cut out the different meetings that we got going on. And we have a pretty good breakout of what's occurring there.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, I sneezed. Like I said, Allan has it appears he's got, are you leading this one on the 19th, Al?
I am not. That's Jeff I think his name is Jeff Trannell from Colorado State. He's going to be on, the specialist out there that does the land work out there.
So there's a lot of good, Glennis, I'm pretty sure on this one, Glennis McClure has one on the ag budget calculator. There's been a lot of time. So this ag budget calculator has things related to like UNL crop budgets. You can find some numbers on there. So I strongly encourage you to check that out. The next workshop that we have in person, we actually have one tomorrow in Lincoln, which if you call Karen Wedding at the Lancaster County Extension Office, she's probably not going to be too happy with late registering, but we can still get you in if you'd like to come to that. Or we have one the following day in Wilbur. The 17th, we're going to be talking a little bit more on carbon credits. The 18th, we're going to be talking a little bit more on ag budgeting. And we also have a workshop here in Dakota City. And there's additional workshops coming up beyond these. These were just the simple first 6 workshops that appeared on the website when I took a look this morning. So with that,
Jim, we got snagged because we forgot to answer one question, and that was, what's the best time to sell ground? That would kind of go along with when's the best time to market your grain. It varies from year to year, and you always know it about 60 days after that date occurred. I can tell you when most land sales do occur, and they occur in the fall, late fall, and early winter. That's when most land sales occur. Whether that's the best time to sell your land, there's no good way to predict that unless Jim's got that figured out, and then he's much wiser than I am. So go ahead, Jim. You got anything to add to that?
Well, Allan's comment on selling in the late fall through the winter time, a lot of those cases, the tenant would probably know that the landlord's intending to sell, so there wouldn't be a lease outstanding, or the operator on the ground has had the ability to harvest or plant. All the major operations are probably done for the year. So that's a very good time because the leases are getting, if you're in the dead of winter, even if the tenant has a lease until February 28th, well, what's the difference if it's, everything's frozen, there's snow out there, right? So we tend to see a lot then. The other time, when is the best time to sell? It appears demand is very good right now. Commodity prices on average beyond livestock, or especially beef, is a little bit different deal, but prices appear to be much better than they were a year ago. If you are thinking about selling, I would probably speculate that your ground is priced very competitively regardless of where you're at. But that winter time frame. And the other thing is moving into these online platforms. We are seeing land sales get outside of that traditional window we mentioned in the fall through the mid to winter, late winter. We are seeing some of them trickle into springtime and summer, but I would speculate you'd see a lot of them, probably, you know, more than half occur during that winter time we mentioned, because the new owner of the property, if you're going to buy a property, you got to have either a tenant lined up or have the ability to secure inputs and some of these things. And given how the supply chains are this year, you definitely want to have your inputs locked down so you know you make sure you can get everything when you need to. Okay, with that, unless there's anything else that comes.
One final comment on that. This is a tongue-in-cheek, not serious comment, but it's got more truth to it than you want to admit. The best time to sow ground is when you have two neighbors with deep pockets who don't know when to quit bidding. But I understand that that's more of a joke than serious. So just take that for what it's worth. I've heard that said far too many times not to throw it in here just for the fun of it.
You're really getting after the point, when do people have money? Well, they tend to have money when the ag economy is doing better. And without a doubt, I think liquidity for many farmers are better this year than they were, say, a year ago.
And the other thing I was throwing in quick, Jim, is that it's not showing up on your screen here, and you did a great job with the screen, no criticism. But on August 26th, the next day after the Dakota City meeting, we're having one in Norfolk. So look that up on the website. You can register for up there too. So we're Dakota City and Norfolk the days after each other, and then there's another one right at the beginning of September in St. Paul. So those are the ones that are left for this summer.
I believe all those meetings, Lincoln, Wilbur, Dakota City, Norfolk, they're all being hosted, I believe, by the local county extension office. So if you didn't have time to find it, just give the local county extension office a call and they can hook you up with any additional information there. Lancaster is always a very big meeting. There's a lot of people that come to that. We will have some even into early September, I believe. So by all means, everybody's welcome to come. And outline for the next webinar, mark it on your calendar, November 15th. We're going to be highlighting the 2021 county level cash rents from the USDA. They published a separate survey from ours. I'll take a look at the ARC and PLC programs. Probably not going to see it nearly as much.
You broke up again, Jim.
On those programs this year as we Al, so I just was pointing out our upcoming meetings. We have the county level cash rents, and then we'll also have a highlight from your stuff. And that will be the outline.
Yeah,
unless you have anything to add.
It'll just be whatever topics come up between now and then. We usually write these things based on the calls we're getting in. So whatever calls we're getting in, we're going to try and highlight those issues, because if you have a call and you call me, that's great, do it. Because if you have that question, probably a bunch of other people do too. So that's why we'll try and highlight that on this seminar.
All right. Very good with that.
Ryan gave a link in the chat on where we're at with how to get across those workshops and to get to all of them. And so you just click on that actually, and you can go right to that page and see where they're all at and what time they start and who to contact to get registered.
All right, with that, I think we're going to probably kill our video and sound. We'll just leave this open for a few minutes as people are trickling off. If they want to hit that link, they can. But unless you have something to add, Al, I think that's everything for me. So thanks for joining, and I thought this was another really good.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being on. We appreciate it.